my side as well. Just before we kick off with the panel, I would like to make a short introduction. We are living in a world that is growing more complex. Technology has changed, and technology is making the world more and more complex. This panel will be about regulations. I'm an architect city planner. I didn't learn law at school. But I have this feeling that as the world is growing more and more complex, then the legal systems also are growing more and more complex. So we actually need to find methods in order to look at the world with bit different eyes, so that the change that's going to happen would be, in the end, understandable for everyone. In Estonia, we have started a special task force on the implementation of AI, and there is several gut feelings and hunches about it. All of us are inventing a bicycle here. We know a lot of fancy words how to describe this change, but still, we are making baby steps. As in Estonia, we are thinking about the same thing as Miguel and Adrian just mentioned, how to build this world of governmental services around the human, around the citizen, the end user. How actually we could depict the fundamental information architecture behind that, at the same time enabling the basic rights and privacy of citizens. There are very big fundamental challenges in order to achieve that. Estonia already has a relatively good digital infrastructure, relatively good digital services, but in the age of AI, as mentioned before, certain biases and effects can actually become exponential if the input data has a certain glitch in it. So we need to figure out a lot of different details. We need to figure out how to connect the databases and all of that. But very fundamental in it is, what kind of a legal framework do we make around that? The concept of a GRAT law, or basically AI law or otherwise, is an idea that we should not take the approach of sectoral or vertical-based legislation. Because governments currently now always look at, for example, self-driving cars, they tend to open up to traffic law. With drones, probably they'll do aviation law. With ships, maritime, and so forth. But this grows the legal complexity quite a bit. If even now there is no person in this room who basically could get all of the laws in Estonia, for example, or in any other country into his or her head, then how can we imagine an even more complex legal system? So we need to figure out ways on how to make it more simple, understandable, and in a way that non-experts would be able to understand how this works. So in a very broad way, we need to define the human-algorithm relationship in a very simple way. As much as I know, actually, legal technically, this is not very difficult, but it is difficult emotionally, because it's a bit question about liability. Currently, everybody is asking who's guilty when something happens. And all laws exist to define liability, because in a matter of conflict, you need to resolve it. So we are not talking about any new type of liability. We are just thinking about how can we use the existing ones to somehow maybe redefine the human-algorithm relationship. So this is a brief background, and also important part, as mentioned before with both Adrian and Miguel, is that we need to engage citizens in order to have an informed discussion. In Estonia, we actually started this discussion last year, just before the previous digital summit, with the idea that maybe we should do that. And we've had this discussion for a while, and not clear yet what the results are, but we are trying to work on it. And I think it's important to cruise in uncharted territories in order to understand that what are the options and what are the different threats in different areas. But in order to have this discussion, do we need to regulate algorithms, and potentially then how? I invite Miguel and Adrian, who were already on the stage with their keynotes, so please. And Härmand, Deputy Secretary General from the Ministry of Justice of Estonia. And hopefully, during this talk, Karmen Turk will also be joining us to have this discussion on, do we need to regulate algorithms? And if the answer is yes, then how? But first, as you've had your intros in a way, so what do you think about this way of looking at regulation? And do you think that, do you have any comments or ideas on that?
Shall I start?
Go ahead.
Look, I am not an expert in regulation by any means, but the conversations that I've been a part of in relation to the regulation of algorithms and data are often, I think, a little misguided in terms of focusing too much on imposing restrictions on and actually trying to regulate data, when what we should be focusing on is the use of data, and in particular the principles that underpin most government regulation today, which is to do no harm. And so I would prefer to see a more principles-based approach rather than a heavily regulated approach. I also think that the comparator is not perfection, but is it better than what we've got today? And so I think we need to look at it a bit more objectively and step back and say, what are we trying to regulate? What purpose or objective are we trying to achieve through regulation? And then be as light touch as possible, so as not to kill off innovation or impede or hamper the development, and then we lose the benefits as a result.
I think I would focus on the accountability question, and specifically the question: can we hold an AI to account? What does that sentence mean? And I suppose there's some different points of view on that. My personal point of view is that I think as humans, we can only really understand accountability in human terms. So our ability to answer the question who is accountable, whether who is a person, will have to be a principle underpinning any regulatory approach that we take. Now, there might be some people who would disagree and say, no, actually, we need to be more imaginative about how we answer that question in relation to AI. But at the moment, my incoming assumption is most people on the street would say, no, when you're talking about accountability, I need to have an answer to the question who is accountable, where that is a human being, regardless of whether there's an AI or anything else involved.
One thing about this mythical character in Estonia, the Kratt, is also the idea that Kratt always has an owner. So that you can always trace it back to the actual physical person. So I don't know, if you think about algorithms, then this one part of this concept is also that you must not go too technical in regulating this, because we know that tech changes really, really fast. So a kind of a workaround would be something similar to basically legal persons, of registering their company, and at that point specific different rights and responsibilities start to enact. But the idea is still that there's always an owner and a physical citizen in the end. What do you think about this, Kai?
Well, we all like fancy new stuff, new bicycles, new cars, new phones. And many people like new laws. I don't. And I think we can save the planet by reusing or actually reinterpreting the existing ones. I have one favorite book in my bookshelf at work. It's Corpus Juris Civilis, and maybe there are very few lawyers in here, But it's a codification of Roman law, dates back to 536. And I guess the definition of sales law, or sorry, sales contract in that book is quite the same as it is in our current obligation law. So my point is that a good law or good regulation in general is enough abstract that it can survive all technical changes, or most of the technical changes.
Yeah, but for me, it's still to put a bit more interest in this show we're making. For me, I still have this feeling that I always like to look back at history and learn from it, because all actually good new things are forgotten old, I think. But still I have this feeling that the world around is currently changing faster and faster, and in this respect, in this domain, we actually cannot learn too much from history, because the things, world, technology, amount of people, climate, the complexity of interactions has grown immensely from the Roman Empire, for example.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, okay, let's go back to the basics then. Why do we regulate in the first place? We either need to protect somebody, for example, children. We need to ensure some rights, for example, property rights, or we need to have clear rules how to solve the conflict. And, well, it's basically why we need regulation at all. And if we take AI, it's an algorithm. It's a technical solution. Okay. And we want this technical solution to be safe, as you mentioned. Okay. We have actually regulation for product safety. How to produce, how to test, and how to maintain a product. And in that sense, algorithm is also a product. So we have rules for that. Okay, we can ask whether these rules are also meant for non-physical products, and the answer is yes. We have consumer protection rules, because if you buy, for example, a product that is using AI or an algorithm, you need the service to be maintained. I mean, you need your apps to work. Okay, you have consumer protection rules for that. They may be a bit different. We can ask whether the liability question is clear enough in there, but we still have rules for that. And of course, liability. I mean, the whole concept of liability means that there is somebody who will pay the damages or goes to jail. Okay, with AI, it's a bit difficult to put them into jail or how do you restrict them to work. It's not possible, but you can always track down, as you said yourself, a physical or a legal person or natural legal person who is responsible, who is the owner or the beneficiary of the action of the algorithm, and it's all there again.
I suppose one of the problems is a lot of it's happening out of sight. So the extent to which, if I buy a product and it's faulty, or I use a service and it's faulty, that's visible to me, to a regulator. Then the approach you say, I think, makes a ton of sense. I think the challenge with AI is a lot of it is happening in layers which are much harder to scrutinize. So to use the example about training data, within the EU, we have GDPR legislation, which is about the fair and appropriate use of personal information, as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware. But what if an algorithm as part of a product has been developed in another part of the world where they do not have the similar data protection. So we might say, this algorithm has been trained on personal and individual data which has been collected and stored and used in ways which we wouldn't actually support within the EU regulatory context. To what extent is that knowable? What are the implications? Does that mean there's some sort of unethical hidden part within this AI, but it was trained on that data, so it's not actually sitting within the product? So I think it does raise questions which are new forms of questions for regulators, and it raises a problem of visibility as to how a regulator can see beneath the sort of service level itself to understand things like training data, where it's come from, and how it's been handled. And I think that does raise some interesting new questions. I'm not sure what the answer would be, because I agree you don't want to overregulate.
So, as I mentioned, I did not learn law at school, but only architecture and city planning. And this makes me a kind of dumb user in terms of laws, because I really am not an expert in that. But I think this is important, so that basically, okay, people like me or people who don't know legal systems, I know that if they don't know, it does not, they still have to apply it. But still, the idea of reducing legal complexity or the idea of working like on better regulations and ideas. But I noticed that Carmen Turk has reached this room. So I would ask you to also join us. Carmen just came from the Estonian Parliament, from the Constitution Committee, from a very important meeting. But the idea was that Carmen is also one of the persons behind the idea of great law. And maybe you could a bit explain on the idea.
Hi. I hope you have all a wonderful day. So I'll try not to scream in the microphone, and I try not to be too subtle. So I am so sorry I'm late, however. Just out of the few comments that I heard while I was walking here, because it's all speakers all around, I think it's very important for us as regulators or policymakers to make this clear distinction in our head, which is usually very hard to make because we are so used to having software doing all kinds of stuff for us. It doesn't matter whether it's an Excel table or whether it's a platform calculating salaries, they all do stuff for us. So it's very hard for us to make this switch that why do we need to talk about this? So the answer is that, well, we are so very used to this software because this is deterministic. It's if-then. So we always know what will come out. We know when we put input data, we kind of know what comes out. So the problem arises when we have non-deterministic software, saying that whatever input we put in, we can't calculate it backwards anymore and know why it reached the conclusion or why it took upon itself to act in a certain way, and we can't pinpoint why it did that. So if we make this switch in our head, then it's easier to question whether the regulation we have today is sufficient or not. However, when I came in, I saw just the title, Do we need to regulate algorithm? Well, it would be just as good as, do we need to regulate gold? Do we need to regulate land? No, we need to regulate relationships. We can't regulate algorithms. We can't regulate technology. We can regulate what lies before it. So it's development, idea generation, how you build it. Then the algorithm is there. In a non-deterministic way, it means that it keeps evolving, it keeps learning, it keeps adapting. And then this part we can't regulate. We can't do anything about that. If we start doing that, then the Europe will be empty of any innovation, any technical companies who will thrive our communities forward. And we can regulate the before, and we can regulate the after. We can regulate how we buy it, how we use it, how we deploy any systems or devices that use those algorithms. However, making this switch, if you just close your eyes and you think that, well, you have a software that you don't know why, for what reason it made the decision, and this software is unable to explain to you afterwards why it made that decision, then the questions start to pop out. Yes, you start to think, what about transparency? What kind of transparency do we need? What kind of ethical rules do we need? Human dignity could be something that we could think of. Maybe this software, self-learning or not, should it takes human dignity into account. However, try to go to a technical person and say, well, can you write me a code that abides by human dignity? The software technician is, yes, of course. Give me 14 criteria, I'll write it in. And then everyone who has ever studied or has any correlation with law would know that, well, there is no 14 criteria for human dignity, yes, because human dignity is the basis of all the other human rights. So what do you say to the coder? What does it have to write in? So that's the first question regarding how you develop it. The next question after deployment and use, the questions start to pop out that, well, if something happens, yes, we always have to consider that. But it's not about the liability, but it's about who gets to know why it happened. Do you think that a small state like Estonia would make any use of 200 gigabytes of data of an algorithm trying to explain in ones and zeros why it made a decision? I'm not really sure that even all of our universities to put together that and starting to analyze that would give us any solution, legal or otherwise. So what do we mean by transparency? Because this is what we keep saying, yes, transparency by design, ethics by design, dignity by design. We really love those words, but what do they mean? Transparency for a consumer, that's a whole different thing, yes? Transparency for excellence centers in Europe, that could be achieved, yes? The next question, the black boxes. I'm not sure if you already talked about those, but black boxes. We have a lot of already cases where we use algorithms that are unpredictable, making decisions that have impact on our lives. Good example is a compass of US justice system algorithm making suggestion what should be the punishment for the person. The person went to the court and said, well, I don't really understand. Why did I get 6 years? I don't think I deserve that. And only thing that the producer or developer would say that, well, I can just guarantee that algorithm made no mistake. This is what you deserve. Later on, ProPublica published a lot of different expertise about how this algorithm was very biased because it took input data from us. So it was very biased about where this person lived, where he worked, who were the friends in social media. So this is something we could probably make a different move than, for example, US has done and said that, well, if we want users to be able to buy algorithmic devices from our market, then intellectual property should have its limits there. And we can't give you this exclusive right over the trade secrets and confidential information if the users and consumers are using those devices that use such kind of algorithms. So these are the questions that pop up in the mind in the first place, but of course it doesn't end there. In the end, we still have to speak about liability, even though that in all the regimes of Europe, we have so many liability regimes that we really do not need to create new ones. We have enough of them. Everyone who is from German legal culture would know what I mean, from French systems, you would know what I mean. There's way too many of them, so we don't need to create new ones, yes? But we need to establish what are the responsibilities, and not only for the producers, but also for the users. Because the diligence, duties and responsibilities for users cannot remain the same. So they cannot be only those innocent consumers using the devices, but they have to take on some responsibility for updating, upgrading, and making sure they don't connect devices that are not supposed to be connected. Yes, probably. So these are the first ideas, and of course then we could move on when these algorithms would make decisions on behalf of us. And these would be unexpected even to us, but those decisions would have consequences for the other sides of transactions, so they are negotiating, concluded, and executed by the algorithms. How does this transactional civil society would work on? So is the algorithm always making it on behalf of me and I'm always the party to an agreement, or should maybe in some certain circumstances we should say that algorithms should have the right to represent me in some limits? Or should we just take the Roman law and say that, well, it's a slave and that's the master and that's going to work? But it can't really work because you don't really know what those algorithms would be able to achieve. So these are the questions I think Estonia has started to think about and question about. There are definitely no answers yet.
So
but
I think any of you actually have any comments on this Carmen's input?
Well, yes, I think already 3 years ago, Italian and French court ruled that algorithm is a digital administrative act. And if an algorithm is making decisions, then talking about transparency, it should be revealed to a person how the algorithm reached the decision. And if it's not revealed, or if it's not possible to reveal, then it's this decision is not made as it should be. So
Yeah, but this is not achievable in today's. But Miguel, Adrian, have you ever any comments as well?
Well, my comment would be that I think, and this will be a frustrating consultant's answer, right? 'Cause it depends, right? I think it'll be more nuanced in some ways, because there are some use cases where a black box algorithm would be perfectly acceptable, right? Do I really need to know how it arrived at the recommendations to route the bus that way versus this way? I'm not sure if that matters, right? But in the social welfare space, in the employment space, in the tax administration space, etc., we have, you know, certain levels of transparency today around decision making. You know, I have to say, I think we make a lot of assumptions about how transparent we are today, and how justified some of the decisions are today. You know, and whether or not governments would be able to explain how they arrive at every single decision. But technically speaking, that is the architecture of our governance and our institutions. So I think what we need to be working out is, where is it appropriate and acceptable for a black box algorithm, and where is it appropriate, where is it required that it is a white box algorithm? And we accept that there's limitations, or that the white box answer might not be as good as the black box answer, but that's a trade-off that we make, because that's what's in the limits of socially acceptable transparency.
Yeah. Just one remark about the complexities. My friend is doing a coffee startup, and basically if you take the coffee growing process till fermentation, not thinking about roasting, and he has an AI algorithm do it. He has 1,700 different database for different data points for this process, that the coffee farmers in Colombia do it by tradition. One person probably cannot understand 1,700 different moments in that process, but AI can. But Adrian, any thoughts on?
One idea that I think might be worth exploring is to build on the certification and ratings agency type models. So we have fair trade today as a maybe an analogous problem, which is a very complicated supply chain. Someone else can take a look at it independently and say, yes, this is adhering to certain principles or not. We expect auditors to look at financial accounts and say, yes, these have been prepared appropriately or not. We expect the ratings agencies to tell us whether a company is creditworthy, or whether a bond that's been issued is creditworthy or not. I could imagine a similar role for an equivalent organization whose job it is to look at an algorithm, or a black box or not, and say, by testing it with input data and looking at the output data, does this seem to be behaving in a way which is reasonable, fair, equitable, not reinforcing biases? Now, these will be judgments based, but just the same way that judgments for whether something's fair trade or whether something is a creditworthy or not creditworthy. But I think the important point would be to have independent point of view from experts who've been asked to explore whether a particular algorithm is behaving in a way which reinforces our values as a society, or maybe is detrimental to it, and then we can arrive at appropriate considerations on the back of that. That, it seems to me, would be an interesting and helpful role in society, but we haven't got it yet.
So, sorry to maybe make this suggestion a bit too big, but currently we have the World Seed Base in North Norway, I think, where all world seeds are held, so that whenever there's a couple, yes, that thing, meltdown of everything, then we have the base to get the seeds from. if we talk about certification, then we would talk about, for example, UN having an institution who has all the code in the world and has the possibility to actually look into that. That's like the nuclear button squared. Because in order to audit the algorithms and the constant updates of different algorithms, this is really difficult. Plus, auditing all of those algorithms on a real-time basis is actually like 3 times more expensive as writing it. So to know exactly what is going on, what are the different terms, it's really difficult to enforce.
But it's a bit easier. There's a bit easier solution. You can just have the right to question the decision that algorithm makes. And
sure.
you don't need to go beyond all the technical solutions.
Yeah, I was also, I understand. But
Just maybe a remark. I just watched a really interesting video on, if you know, Stanford University created this self-driving vehicle called Stanley. The first one to take up on itself to finish a race through desert. I think it was about 230 miles, I think. And it made it. And so in the end, they decided that, well, first thing, let's try to audit why it decided to do one or the other thing. Well, there were a million lines of codes just created throughout this 230 kilometers. So who would do that? That's, I think, a question that we would be in a very hard position to reply. And the second one, they tried to ask Stanley that, well, why did you slow down almost to full stop in the kilometers of 119? What happened? And the algorithm just shot out huge amount of data trying to explain, but it's not auditable in a very scalable way, so that it would be, you would have an answer within a year at least. It would take 3-4 years to try to analyze this amount of data. So I think that's the problem with this outside independent certification. I think otherwise would solve most of the problems that we are talking about.
The suggestion I'm making is merely that if we are concerned about, say, racial bias, we should be testing for that. Someone should be asking the question, does this algorithm reinforce or not potential biases? So it's not that we have to explain everything, it's not that we have to go through all the lines of code, but if as a society we've got particular values that we want to make sure we're protecting, I think we do have a duty to ask those questions of algorithms, even if it's a cost on society, because I think that will be a price worth paying.
So, as all of you heard, there is no clear answers today. So, unfortunately, we have run out of time, and this talk ends now. But thank you.